This talk will look specifically at symbols and super meaning, symbols being the symbolic domain of the unconscious, and super meaning inspired by Viktor Frankl. It's the idea of some transcendent meaning that goes beyond personhood, that goes beyond the individual and even humanity. There are lots of different perspectives on meaning. We might describe a meaningful experience, a meaningful conversation, strive to live a meaningful life. We might look for the meaning of something. Now, this is a slightly different definition. The meaning of something is to look for comprehension and understanding when presented with a dream, presented with an experience in life, even presented with a conversation with someone else. And we want to try and understand and discern the deeper meaning of what they're trying to communicate with us. Typically, meaning has high emotional or spiritual value. There's a quote that Frankl includes in Man's Search for Meaning. He who has a why can bear any how. Meaning is the why. And this kind of meaning overlaps and is interconnected to a sense of purpose. Frankl discovered while he was imprisoned in concentration camps during the Holocaust that those people who had some kind of purpose, some meaning, something to anchor into, were the ones that handled the trauma and the suffering the most. They adapted. They had something like a North Star to look towards even in their darkest moments. And that seemed to be the thing that carried many people through. As an extension, we could argue that meaning can be used as an adjective, such as meaningful work, as a verb, to do something meaningfully, and in a way that I'm interested in, as a noun. So meaning inherent as an object of itself, as something that doesn't have to be a description or an action, but is actually inherent. As a writer, I'm someone that does pay a lot of attention to the etymology and the definition of language. I think that there are hidden messages in the origin of the words that we use. So it's always important to look at that. Meaning is defined as what is meant by word, text, concept, or action. So going back to that, what is the meaning of something? It's an implied or explicit significance. It's important or worthwhile. Again, that the word purpose is very much related to this. And it's also defined as intended to communicate something that is not directly expressed. So there's an inference, a meaningful look, a meaningful suggestion. In an essay I wrote for the Playful Universe, which was a book looking at consciousness and synchronicity, I used the etymology of meaning to create a framework for that essay. There's a really interesting link to the 1300s. I think it's Latin, and I've got no idea how to pronounce this. I think it's, let's just say meaning in a similar way. But it relates to, on one hand, the sense that which is intended to be expressed. So intended, not necessarily the precise words or language or the modality, the vehicle, but actually the intention of that. But also the act of remembering. And that, for me, when I saw that, meaning as the act of remembering was profound, because it points to this process of forgetting who we are and remembering who we are. And that doesn't have to be grandiose. It can be remembering our spiritual nature. It can be remembering the soulfulness of our lives. But even in a meaningful conversation, there is a part of that that feels like an act of remembering what is meaningful to you, remembering what it feels like to connect, remembering who you become when in flow and when discussing topics that are inherently meaningful. Returning to a quote from Viktor Frankl, the founder of logotherapy, and in this quote, he is talking about the transcendent noun type meaning. This ultimate meaning necessarily exceeds and surpasses the finite intellectual capacities of man. In logotherapy, we speak in this context of a super meaning. What is demanded of man is not, as some existential philosophers teach, to endure the meaninglessness of life, but rather to bear its incapacity to grasp its unconditional meaningfulness in rational terms. Logos is deeper than logic. Now, unsurprisingly, for such a deep thinker like Frankl and such a heartfelt teacher, this quote is profound in the sense that we live, even more so than when Frankl wrote this, we live at a time that pedestals logic. It views logic and reason as the be all and end all, not intentionally necessarily, but the quest for meaning can always be within that paradigm, within the paradigm of reason or logic. I'm going to think my way through and reason through to find meaning. But here, Frankl's arguing that the transcendent is ineffable. It's never going to be captured by logic. Logos in this sense is the ineffable nature of God, and that includes meaning itself. Even a slight taste of meaning to that degree is enough to completely open the heart and mind to catapult you into a sense of awe and wonder, whilst not being able to fully grasp it, to be able to say, what does this mean? Because the inherent meaningfulness of the experience itself is whole, is perfect in that sense. So there's nothing to inquire from that type of experience. This does as well speak to an inherent order, one that coalesces around meaning. Synchronicity is, of course, the biggest indicator of some kind of meaningful order. Various models of reality, including dual aspect monism by Howard Atmanspracher. I have a podcast episode with him that I encourage you to watch. These models point to meaning as being a substrate of reality. There's also the model from David Bohm, wholeness in the implicate order, and the idea of the implicate and the explicate that really does marry nicely with Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. We might look to things such as the Fibonacci sequence that appears in nature in again, quite an ineffable way. The process of evolution not being by chance or natural selection, but that there's an orchestrating force, a guiding principle behind the journey that we're on as a species and humanity and Earth and the cosmos. And that being one of increasing complexity of consciousness. Again, more to suggest that the point of complex consciousness is what draws forth evolution rather than it just emerging from material processes. We can also look back to Plato and Aristotle and look at the properties of being that include truth, unity, beauty, and goodness. Now, for me, these words as symbols and what they mean, when I contact them, they do have that inherent quality, like beauty, for example. There's something in witnessing something beautiful in its pure form that again has that quality of inherent meaning. You don't have to describe and explain to someone why a skyline at sunset is meaningful. And you may not even articulate it in a way that tries to, because it's just there. It's evident. And that's something that can be shared, but it's also deeply personal. The question then becomes, is this meaning inherent in our lives? Do we have a fundamental purpose? And that's what leads us on to symbols. Symbols convey multiple meanings beyond the paradigm of logic and reason. Symbolic meaning then is pre-verbal. We're moving more towards not a regressive, but a primordial sense of intelligence, where one symbol has the impact of being able to land in a certain way, in a way that language and reason and rationality is unable to grasp. I sense this as often we have to move to the most recent part of our brains. We can kind of go from a deep sense of knowing and understanding, and as that knowing and understanding is brought into the rational, into the logical, we slowly have to start to create a structure or a conceptual framework for that meaning. And there's always a risk that loses connection to the original spark of meaning in itself. How many of us can relate to the experience of having a meaningful dream or a synchronicity, and then trying to verbalize what it means and just feeling like the words are not there. The words will not do it justice. Whereas a symbol on a subjective, as a subjective experience, can convey meaning even when words fail us. We also then get to the point of intuition, knowing, the sublime emotions. Like in Buddhism, what they talk of the sublime emotions. They aren't just conventional highs and lows. There are experiences of awe and wonder and compassion, and wisdom, you could argue, has an emotional component. But often meaning can be felt and intuited before it's rationally understood. We can also try to rush in to understand in a logical or rational way, and that's something I'm going to return to. Of course, one of the biggest visionaries in terms of our understanding of symbolism was Carl Jung, and he looks at symbols as part of our unconscious. The symbolic domain surfaces in dreams and waking reality, but dreams are less structured. They have less of that mental conceptual framework, so they are more primordial. They're more raw in terms of its individual components, and therefore closer to the symbolic dimension. And the symbolic is very much part of the same imaginal domain as the mythological. And that domain is a carrier of meaning in a way that is much, much more profound and powerful than logic. And you could argue, at least the way I see it, these domains are closer to the foundational meaning. And that's not to say that logic and reason cannot be profoundly meaningful. I think this is the bedrock of philosophy, right? But mythology is closer in some way, entangled and synthesized with emotionality and that essence of meaning, which allows these stories to touch us in ways that just the mere language doesn't. And the expression of these domains include poetry, story, music, and other emotionally driven forms of comprehension. Because meaning is inherently a subjective experience, we start to look at the subjective versus the objective. This is foundational in terms of a self-inquiry practice. If you really get into meditation, if you're into non-duality, sooner or later, and probably sooner, you're going to come across the subject-object dichotomy. And that's basically to inquire into the nature of the phenomenon of experience and to notice the relationship between the subjective, the I, and the objective world. It does go deeper than that. And as we go into these deeper layers of awakening, things that initially appear to be subjective become objective. We objectify them. That includes our thoughts, our emotions, our body, etc. At the same time, the deeper you go into pure subjectivity, you realize that it's actually full with meaning. At least I would argue that. This idea of Satchitananda in Hinduism, truth, consciousness, bliss, is meaningful. It's the meaningful ground of reality. So transcendent meaning, the properties of being, Frankl's super meaning, they all point to meaning beyond the narrow confines of ego. And it's as if this essence of meaning is projected out holographically in a multitude of ways. We might feel as if a specific event, a specific relationship, something that we're interested in, is an object that is meaningful, rather than actually a reflection of a deeper structure and order of meaning. And to quote from my interview with Harprakash Khalsa, there's this term, the meaning crisis. When I hear that, I immediately think, at which scale? There's meaning in the conventional world, and there's knowing yourself at the deepest level, as Buddha nature, primordial perfection. Know yourself like that, and there's meaning independent of the conventional. It's independent and also interdependent as it's integrated. In other words, you feel you can fully show up to your life, and no matter what the outcomes are, you can feel a fundamental okayness. So Harprakash was a brilliant interview. I really appreciate his lucidity in expressing these ideas. Talks to the scales of meaning and the idea that through meditation, you can get to the essence of meaning, and there's a fundamental ground of your being that leads to that fundamental okayness, that the context, the specific expression of your life can be meaningful at that scale, but all the way down to the foundation of being itself, there can be a sense of meaningfulness and, of course, peace, contentment, and other qualities that come with that ground. So you might get the sense that we're starting to explore relative meaning and how that relates to super meaning. And what I mean by this is, in a lot of spiritual traditions, there's this idea of fundamental truth and relative truth. Fundamental truth being something that is innately real or innately true, and relative truth being in the domain of duality, in the domain of the conceptual, in the domain of comparison, for example. To give you an idea of what I mean by this, and hopefully it's a decent example, if you look at a tree and you stand next to a tree, and you might look at the tree and say, this tree is big, right? It's 10 times bigger than you are. And that statement is true. It's relatively true. The tree is big compared to the size of your body. If you were to take that tree and put it next to Mount Everest, and then you say the tree is small, arguably that statement is true. And it's just as true as the original statement that the tree is big. There's a relativity there that makes that true. But the foundation of that depends on context. This is where the potential conflict of depth psychology and non-dual traditions arises, because non-dual traditions emphasize the illusion of worldly objects. They say that everything we see is Maya, it's an illusion. It's pointing us to that understanding of inherent meaning. Whereas depth psychology emphasizes the meaning in and of worldly objects. Developing a meaningful life, finding meaning in your emotions, in your soul even. So you can almost see how certain meditative non-dual traditions take away or change the perspective on the inherent value, the meaningful value of internal phenomena, including emotions and thoughts. Whereas depth psychology places high value on them in different ways. And that's something that has to be reconciled on this journey, to reconcile what is meaningful and in what context. Which then leads us on to, is meaning created? Do we conjure up meaning? Or is it revealed? Or is it both? The idea of trying to find meaning and looking for meaning point to cognitive processes. Again, if we take this fundamental understanding that meaning is inherent, on some level, trying to find that could be trying to contact that domain. In another way, it could be analyzing, using reason and logic, and interpreting events in a certain way to try and find meaning in that. But of course, interpretations and reading into events is open for distortion. I want to emphasize as well the word trying to find meaning, because often when we try, there's a sense of forcing our way through, or a sense of effortfulness rather than effortless effort, as Zen talks to. In trying to find the meaning, there's a sense of maybe urgency or impatience or even desperation. We want certainty. We want the solution. We want to try and find what something means. There's always a risk that the ego hijacks this process into confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is a real thing, and it is used frequently to disparage synchronicity. People that are very materialist in that sense will try and argue that synchronicity is just a psychological process of seeing, making connections that aren't there. I would argue that the cognitive confirmation bias is one domain, is one level, where dots are joined based on a fantasy, a fear, some kind of wounding, almost like a a knot or something, an imprint in your psychology that has a gravitational pull, so that random, except not random, but phenomena in your environment, including your thoughts and the external world, can gravitate around that. So say, for example, you've got low self-esteem or you're struggling with self-rejection, there's a chance that in the manifestation of your life, things will occur that kind of get pulled into that gravitational field of self-rejection. Now, that's also, we could go further out and say, well, that's also shows the inherent pull to see our own wounds and to heal them in even the confirmation bias. So there's learning there as well. I would argue to some extent, if you have to look really hard for meaning, it's likely unavailable and non-existent. And that's where patience comes in. You can have a dream, for example, or a synchronicity where the meaning doesn't fully make sense for years, if not decades. Like I've got a dream, for example, I've written about, the lucid leaf, that continues to reveal things to me. So the desire to try and rush for meaning can also be a sidestep and a way to trick ourselves, or a way to try and rush a process that is unfolding organically. And then there's the understanding of the dangers of narcissistic distortion, which Richard Tarnas talks about in this brilliant quote from Cosmos and Psyche, also a podcast guest, which I highly recommend. And in the book, he says, a painstaking cultivation of self-knowledge must be undertaken to avoid succumbing to mere projection. Discriminating requires a self-critical awareness of unconscious tendencies towards narcissistic distortion, by which random or peripheral events are continually transformed into signs of an egocentric universe. No less crucial is the development and balanced interplay of multiple faculties of cognition: empirical, rational, emotional, relational, intuitive, symbolic. A capacity for acute yet balanced discernment has to be forged, founded not only on an alertness to meaningful patterns, but also on a disciplined mindfulness of the larger whole within which the individual self seeks orientation. It's a brilliant quote. I want to let that land and settle, and for that to create any response within you. And as we draw this presentation to a close, I'm going to leave with some questions to reflect on. Feel free to use these in any way you see fit, maybe in a journaling practice, or just in contemplation, or even just in the moment right now as you kind of relate to this content. And the first question is, what is your relationship to meaningful coincidence? How do you sense you relate to the experience of meaningful coincidences? Are you more skeptical and dismissive? Are you more yearning for their appearance and attached to them to guide you along the way? Do you practice discernment when signs appear, or do you get lost in the flow? This was a big part of the talk as well, discerning between when do you follow the sign and when do you step back? Can you discern between meaning that is revealed versus meaning created by the ego, or the confirmation bias that we spoke of? Where do the different scales of meaning surface in your life? Are you prioritizing certain scales over others? So, for example, are you really focused on self-realization? So you're just in a meditation practice, contemplating a lot, trying to connect to that inherent internal sense of meaning? Or are you seeking to create meaning in your life circumstance? And there's nothing wrong with either of those, but just to get you to think about the balance. And do you rush to interpret meaning literally or rationally, rather than practice intuitive understanding of their symbolic relevance? Is there a desire to know? Is there a desire for certainty? Or can you let the meaning itself just sit and marinate, and to slowly reveal itself to you? Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope it's given you something meaningful to reflect on. Look forward to hearing your comments if you have any. and things that surface for you. And I'll be back again soon. I'm going to do another video like this, looking at the overlap between dreams and meaning, and that'll be available soon.